On May 7, 1945, General George S. Patton marched into Eisenhower's headquarters with a proposal so explosive it would shatter their decades-long bond and redefine the future of the Western world. While millions celebrated the fall of Nazi Germany, Patton saw not a conclusion, but a terrifying opening act for a Third World War against a new, predatory titan rising from the east. The air inside the headquarters in Reims, France, remained thick with the scent of map ink and stale tobacco, yet the atmosphere shifted violently the moment George S. Patton Jr. stepped across the threshold to confront Dwight D. Eisenhower. These two giants of the American military machine had forged their careers in the red clay of Georgia and the dusty plains of Kansas, sharing meals, family secrets, and the immense burden of command long before the first boots hit the beaches of Normandy. Eisenhower, the supreme diplomat and master of the Grand Coalition, looked upon a map of a liberated Europe and saw the promise of a hard-won peace, while Patton, the quintessential cavalryman who lived by the sword, saw only a tactical vacuum being filled by the Red Army. Patton did not come to offer congratulations for the German surrender that had occurred only hours prior. Instead, he arrived to demand that the greatest fighting force in human history remain on a war footing to strike the Soviet Union while the iron was still hot. He argued with a ferocity that bordered on desperation, insisting that the United States must provoke a border incident within 10 days to justify a preemptive strike against their supposed allies, before the Soviets could consolidate their grip on the bleeding remains of Eastern Europe. Eisenhower stared at his old friend with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief, knowing that the American public had been fed a steady diet of propaganda, painting Uncle Joe Stalin as a heroic partner in the crusade against fascism. The Supreme Commander understood the brutal arithmetic of war better than perhaps any man alive, having signed the casualty list for D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, and he recoiled at the prospect of igniting a fresh massacre that could consume another generation of American sons. Eisenhower's rejection was not merely a military decision, but a political necessity, as he was bound by the agreements made at Yalta and the overarching desire of President Truman to transition toward a global diplomatic order. Patton, however, saw this adherence to diplomacy as a death sentence for Western civilization, believing that every mile of ground ceded to the Red Army was a betrayal of the very liberty they had crossed the Atlantic to defend. As the Third Army drove deeper into the heart of the collapsing Reich, reaching as far as Pilsen in Czechoslovakia, Patton's intelligence officers began delivering reports that read more like horror stories than military briefings. While Eisenhower was focused on the logistical nightmare of governing a ruined Germany, Patton was witnessing the systematic dismantling of Eastern European society at the hands of Soviet liberators, who behaved more like a conquering horde. He watched as entire factory complexes were uprooted and shipped eastward on rail cars, and he listened to the harrowing testimonies of liberated American prisoners of war who had been stripped and beaten by Soviet troops. The general's fury reached a boiling point when he was ordered to halt his advance and allow the Red Army to take Prague, a move he considered a strategic catastrophe that effectively handed the keys of Central Europe to the Kremlin. Everywhere the Third Army encountered the Soviets, they saw the same pattern: summary executions of anti-communist sympathizers, the installation of puppet regimes in Poland and Romania, and the rounding up of entire populations for the gulags. To Patton, the Soviet Union was not a partner in peace, but a predatory tiger that had merely waited for the Nazis to fall before leaping upon the remains of the continent. He wrote to his wife Beatrice with a chilling clarity, noting that the Russians gave him the impression of something to be deeply feared in the future world political reorganization, a sentiment he would soon begin shouting from every rooftop. He assessed the Red Army not as an invincible monolith, but as an exhausted, overextended force that was currently living off captured German supplies and lacked the sophisticated air cover of the Americans. Patton calculated that with the United States at its peak military strength and possessing absolute air superiority, the Red Army could be driven back to its borders in as little as 6 weeks. By July 1945, the rift between the two generals had transformed from a private disagreement into a full-scale professional war fought through press conferences, leaked intelligence, and back-channel political maneuvers. Eisenhower, now governing a fragile peace from his high-profile position, became increasingly alarmed by Patton's refusal to adhere to the official Washington line regarding Soviet cooperation. The Supreme Commander understood that his own future, perhaps even a path to the White House, depended on maintaining the image of a successful, harmonious alliance that had saved the world from darkness. Patton, conversely, began using his hero's welcome tour and his subsequent role as the military governor of Bavaria to launch a one-man crusade against the Truman administration's foreign policy. He shared classified intelligence assessments with war correspondents, describing the systematic brutality of the Soviet occupation and warning that the rapid demobilization of American forces was a historical blunder of the highest order. Every time Patton spoke to a reporter, he was effectively firing a shot at Eisenhower's reputation, forcing the Supreme Commander to choose between his loyalty to a legendary warrior and his duty to the political machine in Washington. The pressure from the War Department and the State Department became a deafening roar, with officials in the Truman administration demanding that the rogue general be brought to heel before he sabotaged the founding of the United Nations. Eisenhower summoned Patton to multiple tense meetings, giving him direct, written orders to cease all public commentary regarding Soviet policy, but Patton's sense of moral obligation overrode his military discipline. He believed that silence was a form of cowardice, and that if the American people knew the truth about what was happening in the East, they would never allow their government to disarm in the face of such a clear and present danger. Knowing that firing Patton for his anti-Soviet stance would turn him into a political martyr for the conservative press, Eisenhower's circle waited for a more appropriate excuse to remove the legendary commander from his seat of power. That opportunity arrived in September 1945, during a routine press conference in Bavaria, where Patton, in his typical blunt fashion, made a series of remarks regarding denazification that were politically radioactive. He suggested that removing every low-level Nazi Party member from administrative roles was as impractical as removing every member of the Democratic or Republican parties from local government in America. The media, which had once worshipped Patton for his lightning strikes across France, pounced on the comments, framing him as a sympathizer or, at the very least, a man whose political judgment had completely evaporated. Eisenhower acted with surgical precision, using the public outcry as the official justification to relieve Patton of his command of the beloved Third Army only 6 days after the headlines hit. It was a professional execution disguised as a personnel reassignment, a move designed to strip Patton of his tanks, his men, and his platform before he could do any more damage to the delicate post-war order. Patton was relegated to the command of the 15th Army, a paper organization headquartered in Bad Nauheim that existed solely to compile the official history of the war in Europe. The man who had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers and shifted the borders of nations was now confined to a requisition building with a handful of clerks and historians, tasked with reviewing documents instead of moving divisions. This was meant to be his Siberia, a quiet corner of Germany where the old blood and guts would fade into irrelevance while the architects of the Cold War began their work in the shadows. Despite his reduced status, Patton refused to stop his barrage of warnings, spending his days at the 15th Army headquarters, drafting detailed intelligence reports and personal letters to anyone in Washington who would still listen. He became a magnet for disgruntled officers and intelligence agents who were seeing firsthand the same Soviet atrocities he had witnessed, and he funneled their reports directly to the War Department. He argued that the point system of demobilization was a catastrophe, as it sent the most experienced American veterans home, just as the Red Army was consolidating its strength along the new frontiers of the East. Patton's letters from this period reveal a man who felt the weight of the future pressing down on his shoulders, repeatedly predicting that a massive confrontation was inevitable and that the window for a decisive Western victory was closing with every passing hour. He met with Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson in December, delivering a final grim prophecy that the Soviets would maintain a permanent, iron-fisted occupation of Eastern Europe if they were not confronted immediately. Patterson, representing the official stance of a war-weary administration, listened politely but made it clear that the United States would not risk World War III to save Poland or Czechoslovakia. Feeling completely defeated by the very government he had served with such distinction, Patton realized that as long as he wore the uniform, he was muzzled by the chain of command and the shadow of Eisenhower's authority. He made a fateful decision. He would return to the United States on December 10th, resign his commission, and take his case directly to the American public as a private citizen. He intended to strip away the diplomatic niceties and tell the story of the predatory tiger in a way that would force Washington to act. But fate had one final tragic intervention prepared for the morning of December 9th. At precisely 11:45 in the morning, on December 9, 1945, the destiny of the post-war world collided with a 2.5-ton army truck on a remote road near Mannheim, Germany. General Patton sat in the plush rear seat of his 1938 Cadillac limousine, traveling toward a planned hunting trip that was meant to be his final act of recreation before returning to America to resign and take off the muzzle. The impact itself was deceptively minor. The truck, driven by Sergeant Robert L. Thompson, made a sudden left turn at an intersection, striking the Cadillac at low speed, while the driver and Patton's chief of staff, Hobart Gay, walked away with barely a scratch. The sudden deceleration threw Patton forward with violent force. His head struck the metal partition behind the driver's seat, snapping his neck and instantly severing his connection to the physical world he had conquered with such ferocity. As he lay paralyzed on the floor of the car, Patton remained eerily calm, possessing the lucidity to ask his companions if they were hurt before realizing he could not move his own limbs. This was a man who had survived strafing runs, tank battles, and the relentless pressure of the European theater, only to be brought down by a fender bender on a quiet Sunday morning. The timing was so impeccable that it immediately ignited a firestorm of suspicion that continues to smolder in the annals of historical conspiracy. Just 3 days prior, Patton had presented his final, most aggressive assessment of the Soviet threat to the Secretary of War, and he was scheduled to depart for the United States the very next day to begin his public campaign against the Truman administration's foreign policy. The coincidence was not lost on the military community or the intelligence services of the burgeoning Cold War. Rumors began to circulate that the accident was orchestrated by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, who viewed Patton as the single most dangerous man in the West. Others pointed toward the Office of Strategic Services, the American precursor to the CIA, suggesting that Washington could not allow a loose cannon of Patton's stature to return home and dismantle the fragile diplomatic bridge they were trying to build with Stalin. While official investigations cited bad luck and unfortunate timing, the fact remained that the only man capable of rallying the American public toward a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union had been silenced at the exact moment his liberation was at hand. Patton was rushed to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, where the world's most elite military surgeons struggled to stabilize his shattered cervical vertebrae. The news of the accident sent shockwaves through the global high command, reaching Eisenhower in Washington within hours and dominating front pages from London to Los Angeles. For 12 agonizing days, the warrior who had commanded millions was confined to a hospital bed, his legendary energy trapped within a body that no longer responded to his will. Despite the catastrophic nature of his injuries, Patton remained conscious and mentally sharp, dictating letters and receiving visitors with a dignity that moved even his most hardened critics. His wife, Beatrice, flew across the Atlantic in a desperate race against time, arriving on December 11 to find the giant of the Third Army reduced to a state of total dependency. Patton, ever the realist, told her he was ready to die, famously remarking that this was a hell of a way for a soldier to die. Yet he spent his final breaths worrying about the soldiers he had left behind and the threat he saw looming in the east. He knew that the paralysis was only the beginning. As his lungs began to fill with fluid, a condition known as pulmonary edema, the physical struggle for every breath became a metaphor for the choking of his warnings by the political machine in Washington. In those final days, the absence of Dwight D. Eisenhower was a deafening silence. The Supreme Commander, caught in the gears of the political machine Patton had warned him about, never made the trip to his old friend's bedside. He sent a telegram, a formal gesture of distress that lacked the warmth of the brotherhood they had shared for decades. The two men who had architected the liberation of Western Europe would never speak again, their partnership ending not in the glow of victory, but in a tragic separation fueled by political convenience and strategic disagreement. On December 21, 1945, Patton's heart finally surrendered, leaving the West without its most vocal prophet just as the Iron Curtain began to fall. Patton had always been a man of the troops, and his final request reflected a humble devotion that stood in stark contrast to his old blood and guts persona. He rejected the idea of a grand monument in Arlington or a statue in Washington, instead choosing to be buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery among the 6,000 soldiers of the Third Army who had fallen during the Battle of the Bulge. On Christmas Eve, 1945, under a gray, somber sky, the general was laid to rest in the very mud he had conquered, surrounded by the young men who had followed him into the mouth of hell. The funeral was a moment of profound irony for the few who understood the depth of the tragedy unfolding in the East. As the dirt was shoveled over Patton's casket, the Soviet Union was already systematically violating the Yalta Agreements, arresting resistance leaders in Poland and ensuring that the free elections promised to the people of Eastern Europe would never take place. The general was buried while the very predatory tiger he had wanted to cage was extending its claws over half of the European continent. His death marked the end of the era of the warrior diplomat and the beginning of a cold, calculated stalemate that would define the next 4 decades of human history. Even in death, Patton's influence was impossible to erase. His grave became a pilgrimage site for soldiers and civilians alike, a reminder of a commander who prioritized victory and truth over the comforts of political safety. But while his men honored him, the establishment in Washington worked quickly to bury his warnings along with him, continuing the policy of containment that accepted Soviet domination of the East as an unchangeable reality. The world was moving on to a fragile, ugly peace, leaving the warrior to sleep among his fallen brothers, while the concrete of the Berlin Wall began to take shape in the minds of the Kremlin's architects. The tragedy of George S. Patton is not that he was wrong, but that he was right far too early for the world to listen. Within 6 months of his death, every dark prediction he had made began to manifest with chilling accuracy. In Poland, the Soviets executed the very resistance fighters who had spent 6 years battling the Nazis, while in Czechoslovakia, the democratic government was systematically undermined until it was finally overthrown in a 1948 communist coup. The Red Army did not go home. They stayed, turning liberated nations into satellite states governed by terror and puppet administrations. In March 1946, only 74 days after Patton's burial, Winston Churchill stood before an audience in Fulton, Missouri, and gave voice to the reality Patton had seen months earlier. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent, Churchill declared, using the very imagery Patton had anticipated during his heated arguments with Eisenhower. By 1947, the Truman administration was forced to officially abandon the policy of cooperation and adopt the strategy of containment proposed by George Kennan, which was essentially a defensive version of the stance Patton had urged them to take in May 1945. The most painful validation of Patton's foresight came in 1950, when American soldiers found themselves once again in combat, this time fighting communist forces in the hills of Korea. The global confrontation Patton had predicted had begun, but it was being fought under much less favorable conditions than those that existed in the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender. In 1945, the United States possessed a monopoly on atomic weapons, complete air superiority, and a battle-hardened army at its peak. By 1950, the Soviets had their own nuclear deterrent and a consolidated grip on Eastern Europe that would take 45 years and millions of lives to break. Dwight D. Eisenhower eventually transitioned from the uniform of a general to the suit of a president, managing the very Cold War that his old friend had hoped to prevent. As president, Eisenhower was forced to live within the walls of the policy of containment, a strategy that resigned half of Europe to communist tyranny in exchange for avoiding a nuclear apocalypse. Whether Eisenhower ever looked back at that May 7th meeting in Reims and wondered what if remains one of the great secrets of American history. He had chosen the ugly peace over the righteous war, and in doing so, he had achieved his goal of bringing the boys home, but at a strategic cost that would haunt the West for generations. The silencing of George Patton was a victory for the bureaucrats and the diplomats, but it was a catastrophic defeat for the millions of people who spent the next 4 decades living behind barbed wire and concrete. Eisenhower's leadership was characterized by a belief in institutions and the political process, while Patton's was defined by the raw understanding of military force as the ultimate arbiter of history. History has shown that while Eisenhower was the man needed to win the war, Patton may have been the only man with the clarity to win the peace. The legacy of their conflict remains a fundamental question of American leadership. When does political expediency become a betrayal of strategic truth? Patton's 15th Army history staff eventually produced the theater manuals and small wars doctrines that formed the backbone of early Cold War strategy, a final irony that saw the silenced general's intellect guiding the very conflict he was forbidden from fighting. He died believing he had failed, but his failure was simply his inability to tolerate the lies that a war-weary world desperately wanted to believe. If General Patton had been allowed to carry out his plan to push the Soviets back in 1945, do you believe the world would have avoided the Cold War, or would it have sparked an even more devastating World War III? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.